Khandana bhava bandhana jaga bandhana भक्तवृन्द आरति तमा जय जय आरति तमा हर हर आरति तमा शिव शिव आरति तमा खण्डन भाव बन्धन जाग बन्दन वन्दे तमा जय श्री गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ॐ ह्रीं ऋतं त्वमचलो गुणजेत् गुणेभ्यः नाक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्तलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्त्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसां त्वयि तृप्त तृष्णां रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मर्त्यामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्मि नाशन् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारीं शान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेकगम्यं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्म स्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते Ramakrishnaaya Namo Namaha. Om Namo Sri Bhagavate Ramakrishnaaya Namo Namaha. Om Namo Sri Bhagavate Ramakrishnaaya Namo Namaha. Om Sarvamangala Mangale Shive Sarvartha Shadhike Sharanye Trambake Gauri Narayani Namostute. Srishti Sthite Vinashanam Shakti Bhute Sanatani Guna Sraye Guna Maya Narayani Namostute. Sharana Gato Dinarto Paritrana Parayane Sarvas Sharati Hare Devi Narayani Namostute. Jayana Narayani Namostute. Jayanarayani Namostute. Jayanarayani Namostute. Jayanarayani Namostute. Jai Mahamai ki Jai. Jai Bhagawan Sri Ramakrishna Deva ki Jai. Jai Swami Maharaj Ji ki Jai.
Namashri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suray Satchet Sukhasvarupaya Swami Paharine. So today we start the next lecture in the Jnana Yoga series of lectures by Vivekananda. This one is called God in Everything. Before we start with the text per se, should bear in mind that almost all the Upanishads on which these lectures are largely based, they address certain fundamental questions, fundamental existential questions, not abstract ones. So far, what we have been discussing is essentially broadly around the theme of the fact that, well, once one starts inquiring into the real nature of the world and of ourselves, then our common sense idea of reality starts becoming weak. Its rational premises are found to be somewhat doubtful, not very firm-footed. I think much of this was established in the previous lectures. This is what Vedanta calls Jagat Mithyatva and Madhyamaka Buddhism calls Shunyata. This is something we have arrived at. Oh, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that we deal with the world per se on a day-to-day basis. How do we reconcile then, in terms of our day-to-day practice, this idea, which is basically a transcendent reality that we've been talking about, with what is called in hagiology the immanent, basically the world around us. What is to be our attitude towards the world and our fellow beings? This is the kind of question that forms the background of this particular lecture, God in Everything. The scriptural passages, the Upanishadic passages that form the background of this particular lecture, and we'll see these two ideas being explicated as we go on. One is the first passage of the Ishopanishad, which says, Isha Vasyam idam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat. That which is there in this world around us, all of it is to be covered with Isha. That means what we call in our popular parlance God as something that is very far away is to be brought nearer and nearer, so that it not only is identical with our own selves, but also with the world around us. See, the enquiry that is pursued here, it's basically a psychological one rather than a logical one. Psychological in the deepest possible sense, in the most profound sense. It's essentially asking us to examine our common sense worldview, try to go deeper so that there is greater clarity and focus, both in terms of our attitude to ourselves and our attitude to others. This deeper examination allows for the boundaries between oneself and the other to become attenuated. Suppose that boundary, let's just perform a thought experiment. Suppose that boundary vanishes altogether psychologically in our minds, which means we see the emptiness or falsehood of these artificial constructs of boundaries. Suppose that happens. What are the consequences? Psychologically, what are the consequences? And the first consequence is this absence of fear. Why? What is the origin of this ailment that we call fear? The origin is basically that we have something which we are afraid to lose. But lose to whom? Lose to the other. Whoever we regard as the other, that person or that persons or that system is going to take away this that I regard as mine from me. But if on the other hand, the boundaries between oneself and the other have been at least attenuated or at best vanished, then who is there to take away from whom? This is an echo of this Vidyanathananda Upanishad. Yatra sarvam atmai vabhut tat kenakam pashyet kenakam shinuyat etc. Kenakam vijanita vignata ramare kena vijaniyat. There it's put in the form of an enquiry, but here we can see it's almost tautological that once the notion of the other is attenuated, the idea that the other can take away something from me automatically becomes baseless. Consequence, complete fearlessness. This is the core message of the Upanishads, is what Vivekananda has been talking about. Fearlessness, abhi. Abhayam bhayu prapnoti. So this is again there in the Brihadaranyaka. So, one aspect of this understanding, this practice, is analytical thinking, as we've talked about. This is what the earlier lectures focused on. This particular lecture is going to direct that same spirit of enquiry outwards, so to speak, which means to the world and that which we mistakenly call the other. This is where this enquiry is to be directed so that eventually it vanishes. Then these stopgap methods, these stopgap constructs that we have in our heads, this is my country, that is your country, this is my religion, that is your religion, etc., all the basis of strife, at least subjectively, vanishes. Who is the beneficiary? The individual who thought himself or herself to be limited. Once that notion of limitation, which means basically the notion of the other, has decreased, then fear is gone. This strife, this anger, this hatred is gone. And so, there is this dual practice that is advocated here. One, a subjective process of enquiry to understand in our own minds that this notion of me and mine with which we behave all the time is only a temporary construct, an ad hoc construct used by evolution and nature in some sense to make sure that a certain variegated existence persists. That's one aspect of it, the enquiry aspect of it. But how do we translate that idea into our behavior with the world? And the behavior with the world becomes one of oneness, empathy, identity. The former, roughly, is because it's analytical in nature, is roughly referred to as the head or the more intellectual aspect of things. And this, when it's same idea, when it's directed towards the world and develops into a sense of oneness, is called heart. These are just words, because the first emphasizes analysis, the second emphasizes empathy or feeling. But really, these two things are not different. It's essentially the same thing directed inwards or outwards. The language in which we express it may be somewhat different, but in essence, the core psychological aspect that's involved there, if you ignore the direction, is the same. This synthesis is going to be something that Vivekananda analyzes and tries to understand in this particular lecture, and with a focus on this outward direction of this common faculty. Okay? So the question that he is addressing is the following. All right, we understand that there is this elevated philosophy which regards the empirical eye, the eye with which we behave in our day-to-day life, as something lacking in substance, false. On the other hand, how are we going to implement that in terms of our day-to-day life? What is going to be our attitude towards the world? This second question is what is primarily addressed in this particular lecture. As we said, there are two Upanishadic passages. The first, as I said, was Ishavasyam idam sarvam yat kinchadagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bhunjita magrida kasya swiddhanam. This is the first mantra of the Ishopanishad. The other one is from the Chandogya. It says, which we've said here before, Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma, which means all that we see, Sarvam, in front of us, Idam. Yes, Sarvam Khalu Idam. This itself is that which we seek through analysis. Yeah? This pure consciousness, or whatever we call it, that we try to seek as the sum and substance, as the basis of our individualized existence, the generalized impersonal one, that is there right in front of us at every moment of our lives. It's just that our minds are not accustomed to this way of thinking, this way of looking at the world. There's this Vedantic dictum, Drishting Brahma Gyanamayam Kritva Pashed Brahmamayam Jagat. So basically, it's a question of point of view or world view, so to speak. And what world view is conducive to ridding ourselves of our miseries and misfortunes in day-to-day life? This is what is being clarified here. How do we develop a worldview consistent with what we get through our subjective analysis as the basis of our individualized existence? So while the first few lectures emphasized self-enquiry, this one is going to emphasize an elevated worldview where what we call so-called spiritual life is not confined to oneself in isolation, but has its implications in our day-to-day existence in terms of our relationship with the world. With this background, let's start with the lecture. We have seen how, this is where Vivekananda starts, we have seen how the greater portion of our life must of necessity be filled with evils, however we may resist, and that this mass of evil is practically almost infinite for us. We have been struggling to remedy this since the beginning of time, yet everything remains very much the same. The more we discover remedies, the more we find ourselves beset by subtler evils. We have also seen that all religions propose a God as the one way of escaping these difficulties. The fact that we live in a society forces us to have certain rules. And in an earlier society, these rules were formulated in terms of ethical ideas, in terms of this is good and that is bad. This duality was the foundation in earlier societies of all morality. And therefore, because we are complex creatures, a result of a combination of what we call, because it's we who have this idea of a good and evil in our minds, there is this good and bad which we have inside of us, which we project on society and then declare that such and such a thing is good, such and such a thing is bad. And then when we are serious about it and reflect on ourselves, then we see that there are ramifications of both in our own constitution, in our individual subjective constitution. And hence, every moment of our lives has to be a mixture, a confused mixture of ethical opposites. How do we struggle against this? This is the existential problem that is being outlined here. And so a way of escaping from this quandary is proposed by all religions again as a way out, as a way of escape. And so religions propose a God. This is an answer that is given. And if a mind is rational enough, it is certainly possible that such an answer will not satisfy, and a further and deeper enquiry will be necessary. That enquiry is being initiated here. All religions tell us that if you take the world as it is, as most practical people would advise us to do in this age, then nothing would be left to us but evil. They further assert that there is something beyond this world. This life in the five senses, life in the material world, is not all. It is only a small portion and merely superficial. Here is the basic point. What is being proposed is that this sense reality which we perceive as this one real thing in the world is not all. And that it is not all is also a matter of universal subjective experience. Our day-to-day joys and sorrows, the subjective reaction to various life situations, are not objects of the senses. These are aspects of the mind which we know to be something that is not quite captured by our sense experience. It's something more than that. So there is in our lives something that is not quite sense reality. What what this is saying here is that take that subjective experience, the core subjective experience of your empirical existence, and try to go deeper, and then you'll understand that this sense experience is only something that is floating at the surface of our experience, and the experiencer is deeper and hidden in the middle of all that. Life in the material world is not all. It is only a small portion and merely superficial, just the surface reality. Behind and beyond is the infinite, in which there is no more evil. So this existential problem of duality between ethical opposites, particularly that which we want to shy away from, which we call evil, how do we get away from it? By basically seeking that on which the senses and the ideas of senses are based. In other words, penetrate deeper into one's own psyche. This is what is being talked about here. Some people call it God, some Allah, some Jehovah, Jove, and so on. The Vedantin calls it Brahman. One thing that we saw here first is that behind and beyond is the infinite. What does one mean by the infinite? Second, there is no more evil. Can we examine these two things today? And the idea that the Vedantin calls it Brahman. So which means whatever all the theological religions, the dualistic religions call God, Allah, Jehovah, etc., etc., the substance of that is called by the Vedantin Brahman because it is a generalization. So there are these three ideas which we shall examine for the rest of today's discussion. What do we mean by the infinite? Obviously, basically, tautologically, it's something that is not finite. But what is the idea of the finite in our minds? What one means here is that which is limited. Limited by what? Limited by concepts, by ideas, by our sense perceptions. The eye perceives a certain segment of the reality around us. We see the tree, we see some lights. But at any point of time, most of what is there, what we believe is there, is not seen. Similarly for hearing, similarly for all of our senses. It's only a small fragment that is perceived by the senses at all times. This limitation gives rise to the sense of the finite, and all that's there beyond this, included, is referred to as the infinite. This is a psychological explanation, not a logical one. Because this is the way our minds function, and so that's what we are really trying to understand, analyze here. So this is where we are headed. This idea of the finite falls away, which means the limited way by which we gather information, knowledge, is to be attenuated. This is beyond the senses, almost literally, therefore, because the eye cannot perceive what is there behind my head. Yeah? So this is the idea of the infinite as opposed to the finite. Next, in that infinite, there is no more evil. This is a solution that is proposed by dualistic religion's mind. But if you ask them, well, You're saying that there is no more evil. Is there a notion of good? They are conveniently silent about it. It's only in the non-dualistic ideas that this logical implication is dealt with simultaneously. If you have no notion of evil, you can have no notion of good. Dual pairs arise and vanish simultaneously. So, what you are saying is that in this infinite there is no more evil. Fine, the problem has been solved. But at the same time, you also say, and he's going to come to this in the next paragraph, he calls it basically a mosquito sits upon a person's head, and in order to kill that mosquito, you've killed the person also. Yeah, you've beaten him over the head with some strong, some heavy instrument. Certainly the mosquito has died, but the head has been cracked open in the process. Which means that though the sense of, yes, though there no evil has been, the solution of the problem of evil has been addressed, but simultaneously the notion of good has gone also. Is that what we intended? Question. So there's a reluctance to face this in most dualistic ideas, and so one needs further examination. So behind and beyond is the infinite, in which there is no more evil. We've so far understood these two words to some extent. What's the infinite? Something that's opposed to the finite, something that is not limited to very specific sense ideas. Before we go on to this, the next word that we want to understand, namely the Vedantin calls it Brahman, like to mention that even so there's this famous agnostic philosopher Bertrand Russell. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. Some of you have probably read him. There is one particular book of essays by him. I suspect it's either skeptical essays or unpopular essays, in which he says the following: naive realism, which is the standpoint, I'm paraphrasing, I might not be quoting exactly. Naive realism, which is the standpoint that the world is as it is, leads us to the study of physics, which tells us that the world is not as it is. Then he says, so naive realism, if true, is false. So if naive realism is true, it leads to the study of physics, which says that naive realism is false. And then he concludes, hence it is false. So this is a typical kind of tongue-in-cheek humor that Russell used to indulge in. But there's some core content to it here. It's basically encouraging us to inquire into the nature of reality instead of taking whatever we say, whatever we see for granted. Okay. And then let's come to this last thing, and this is the last point that we'll discuss today. How do people name this infinite? Some people call it God, some Allah, some Jehovah, Jove, and so on. The Vedantin calls it Brahman. Note here that, and today we should probably also add that the Buddhists who do not, and the end of the previous lecture we saw that who did not believe in any of these or describe or did not have much regard for any of these dualistic gods, they call it shunyata or emptiness. The more scientifically minded today call it consciousness. It's that same. These are various words. The referent is the same. That which we are referring to is the same. The Vedantin uses the word Brahman. Literally it means something that is great, large. Brinhanat. Yeah, so that's the Sanskrit word, root, which is there at the basis of this word. Brinhanat Brahman. That which is all pervasive, expanded, large is what is called Brahman. Again, it's a referent to the infinite. Literally, not caught within finite frameworks, not caught within finite sensory frameworks, not caught within finite conceptual frameworks. But it is a quest for this unlimited that is at the basis of all dualistic quests as well. It starts with an existential inquiry, an urge of every human mind to go beyond itself. The crucial word here being beyond, also called transcend. Why? Because every human heart has this universal capacity for wonder. What is this? What is this? Ramakrishna says, Eki Eki. This wonder is the raw material that fuels this enquiry. It's the energy behind this enquiry. Various answers are proposed, but the locus of this quest, subjectively, is this feeling of wonder. Could be given other names, other conceptual frameworks, other feeling frameworks, other emotive psychic frameworks. Let's look at wonder. The culmination of that enquiry, fueled by this, leads to these various ideas of the infinite. So if we are to try to catch hold of this idea, Ishavasyam idam sarvam, in the world around us, the practice that's going to be prescribed to us through this lecture, then what should be our focus in our own psyche? It is this feeling of wonder. We experience it whenever we have any kind of a deep, profound experience, listening to a very deep piece of music, reading something which captures something that's universal in human experience. We have this same response. Here, the idea is to bring that experience into every moment, which means this wonder is there with us at every point of time. The very fact that we see this world around us at every moment as a cogent whole is a wonder. Identifying, there's no reason to be this kind of a cogent, ordered universe that we see, yet we do. This evokes that wonder. I'll just conclude with this. I think I've mentioned this once or twice before. There is this book called Subtle is the Lord, which is Abraham Pius's account of Einstein's life, which has a picture of Einstein looking towards the heavens with this enwrapped wonder. Yeah. Basically, it's an enquiry. What is this world? What is the meaning of it all? And goes on to say that there's a statement by Einstein. This is a scientific mind, remember. Says that this feeling of wonder is the noblest emotion that has been given to us as human beings. It's our core investment. How are we going to use it? Yeah. So the rest of this discussion we'll try to answer this question. For today, we stop. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.